Here is a number that should not exist. 89.5% of people who crochet report feeling calmer after a session. 82% report feeling happier, and 74.7% report feeling more useful in their daily lives. Those figures come from a study of more than 8,000 participants, published in the Journal of Public Health in 2020, and when you actually sit with them, they become genuinely strange. Because this is not a pharmaceutical intervention, a clinical program, or a technology that requires specialist access and a referral letter. This is yarn. And 2 sticks. The paradox sitting at the center of this story is worth stating plainly. Elite athletes spend years working with sports psychologists, neuroscientists, and performance coaches, all chasing a specific mental state that researchers call flow, and all paying considerably for the privilege. Surgeons train for it. Fighter pilots train for it. In high-performance circles, it is treated as one of the most valuable and difficult cognitive states a human being can access. And yet, a retired schoolteacher in a community hall, paying almost nothing, picking up knitting needles for the first time in years, is neurologically entering the exact same state. The same brainwave signatures, the same physiological markers, the same measurable shift in how the brain is organizing itself. The question worth answering here is not whether flow through crafting works, because the research on that is fairly settled. The real questions are why it works, how it operates at the level of brain and body, and why something this accessible has taken this long to be treated as anything other than a hobby. Start with the scale of the problem that flow is actually solving, because it is larger than most people realize. According to data released by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration in July 2025, approximately 23.4% of American adults, which works out to around 61.5 million people, experienced a diagnosable mental health condition in the previous year alone. That is not a statistic about people having a difficult week. That is more than 1 in 5 Americans meeting clinical criteria for something that genuinely affects their capacity to function. And the gap between the number of people who need support and the number who can actually access it, whether through cost, availability, or the friction of asking for help in the first place, remains enormous. Against that backdrop, the idea that a structured creative hobby might offer a meaningful, low-cost, accessible route toward mental stability stops being a soft wellness claim and starts looking like a fairly serious public health proposition. The mechanism behind it, flow state, is what gives that proposition its credibility. Flow was first formally described in 1975 by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, a Hungarian-American psychologist who had spent years interviewing people doing things they loved: rock climbers, artists, chess players, surgeons. What he kept hearing across all of those conversations was the same description. Everything just flowed. Actions happened automatically. Time bent in strange ways. The self stepped back from its usual position at the front of experience. He named the state accordingly and spent several decades building a theoretical and empirical framework around it, culminating in his 1990 book, Flow, The Psychology of Optimal Experience, which brought the concept into popular awareness and sparked a long, slow accumulation of research interest that has been growing ever since. In a Wired magazine interview, Csikszentmihalyi described it this way: being completely involved in an activity for its own sake, the ego falls away, time flies. Every action and movement and thought follows inevitably from the previous one, like playing jazz. Which is a beautiful description and also, for researchers trying to measure it, a methodological nightmare. And that brings us to the long-standing problem with flow research, which is worth addressing directly rather than skipping past. For decades, most of the foundational studies relied on self-report data. Participants were asked after the fact whether they had felt immersed, whether time had distorted, whether they had lost track of themselves during the activity. Critics pointed out reasonably that this was not rigorous science, it was recall. And recall is unreliable in ways that are well documented. The challenge skill balance that Csikszentmihalyi identified as the gateway into flow was also difficult to standardize across thousands of different people doing thousands of different activities. And that difficulty gave critics plenty of room to question whether flow was a genuine neurological phenomenon or an appealing story people told about their favorite pastimes. Those were legitimate criticisms. And for a while, they kept flow research at a careful distance from the more demanding corners of neuroscience. But here's the thing. In April 2025, a study published in Scientific Reports changed the methodological conversation in a meaningful way. Researchers identified reliable physiological signatures of flow using wearable devices, specifically a dominance of alpha and theta brainwaves and a U-shaped pattern in heart rate variability. For the first time, you no longer needed to ask someone whether they had been in flow after the fact. You could measure it on their wrist while it was happening. That matters because it addresses the most persistent structural weakness in the entire field. And it arrives alongside a January 2024 paper in Collabra. Psychology, confirming that academic publications on flow have grown exponentially since 2000, spreading across neuroscience, education, sport, and occupational therapy in ways that suggest the field is no longer operating at the margins. Now, the question of why crafting specifically produces this state is where the mechanism becomes genuinely interesting. Flow requires 3 conditions to be present at the same time. The task needs to be clearly defined, with immediate feedback on whether you are doing it correctly. The difficulty needs to be precisely matched to your current skill level, high enough to demand focus, but low enough not to overwhelm you entirely. And the engagement needs to be intrinsic, meaning the doing itself is the reward, not the outcome at the end. Crafting hits all 3 of those conditions with unusual consistency. A knitting pattern gives you clear instructions and immediate tactile feedback on every single stitch, because each one either works or it does not, and your hands know the difference before your brain catches up. The difficulty scales naturally as you move to more complex projects, which means the challenge skill balance recalibrates without any conscious effort on your part. And the act of making something physical from nothing, watching an object emerge under your hands, is among the most intrinsically motivating experiences available to the human nervous system. You are not doing it for a grade or a performance review. You are doing it because something in your biology finds it deeply satisfying, and that distinction turns out to matter enormously. Beneath all of this sits a neurological layer that explains the physical effects people report. Repetitive rhythmic motion, the kind that defines knitting, crochet, and weaving, activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the branch of your autonomic nervous system responsible for the rest and digest response, the one that counteracts the stress state your body defaults to under pressure. Cortisol falls, breathing slows and becomes more regular. Australian psychologist Sarah O'Doherty described it directly. Heart rate and breathing even out, and blood pressure drops measurably. And then the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for self-monitoring, self-criticism, and the particular cognitive loop that makes anxiety so exhausting to live with, begins to quiet. Researchers connect this to what is called the transient hypofrontality hypothesis, which holds that sustained rhythmic engagement reduces activity in the prefrontal regions, temporarily freeing the brain from the weight of self-referential thought. In flow, you are not thinking about the fact that you are thinking. You are simply doing, and the brain finds that state genuinely restful in ways that passive distraction, scrolling, watching, listening, generally does not produce. Betsan Corkhill, a UK author and one of the pioneers in the field of therapeutic knitting, found in her clinical work that participants managing depression who took up knitting reported feeling happier or very happy after sessions. The organization she is connected with, Stitchlinks, has been building an evidence base for therapeutic crafting for years, largely outside the mainstream academic spotlight, which, if you think about it, is a fairly accurate metaphor for how this entire field has operated until recently. The longitudinal evidence adds another layer. A 2024 study published in Translational Psychiatry followed 9,361 pairs of twins over an extended period and found that individuals who were naturally prone to experiencing flow states were considerably less likely to receive clinical diagnoses of depression, anxiety, and stress-related disorders across their lifetimes. The twin design is what makes this finding particularly useful because it controls for genetic factors in a way that standard cohort studies cannot. This was not simply a correlation between a certain personality type and a tendency toward well-being. It was a longitudinal finding that survived the kind of scrutiny that self-report flow research often cannot. But the story gets more complicated here, and more interesting for it. The same body of research has identified what several studies describe as a post-flow tunnel vision effect. 3 studies involving 746 participants found that people emerging from a flow state showed a temporarily reduced capacity for creative flexibility on tasks that immediately followed. The brain had been operating in a focused, automatic, non-divergent mode, and it takes a short period to reopen after that. Coming out of the zone narrows your thinking slightly, for a window that varies between individuals. That is not an argument against flow, but it is a reason to think carefully about timing. Using a craft practice as a deliberate wind-down after cognitively demanding, open-ended creative work is where the evidence suggests the most benefit. Using it immediately before a task that requires broad associative thinking might not be the optimal sequence. That kind of nuance gets lost almost entirely when a research finding gets absorbed into wellness content, which tends to prefer simple directives over mechanism. And the distinction matters most for the people who actually need this to work, rather than simply to sound appealing. The social dimension of crafting is another element that tends to get overlooked entirely in how this subject is usually discussed. Researchers, including Betsan Corkhill, have noted that crafting functions as a kind of social structure for people who find conventional interaction difficult. When a group gathers to knit or crochet together, the focus of attention sits on the work rather than on the participants themselves. There is no obligation to maintain eye contact, no pressure to fill silence, and the conversation that does happen carries lower stakes because everyone in the room has something to do with their hands. For people managing social anxiety, that structural shift is not a small thing. It can be the practical difference between joining a community and not joining one. And community is itself a documented buffer against the mental health conditions the crafting is simultaneously addressing. A 2025 study from the University of York, published in Frontiers in Public Health, examined outdoor heritage crafting workshops and found something that made researchers stop and check their data. Every single participant was retained across the full program. In a field where dropout is one of the most persistent methodological problems, that result came with high satisfaction reported across all participants. That result, sitting alongside the neurological evidence for flow, the longitudinal twin data on mental health outcomes, and the 8,000-person mood study, starts to build a picture that is considerably harder to dismiss than the wellness industry framing it usually receives. If you want to follow research like this as it develops, particularly where neuroscience and everyday human behavior intersect in ways the mainstream tends to overlook, this channel covers exactly that territory. The commercial picture reflects what people are already experiencing on their own. The global arts and crafts market carried a value of approximately $47.35 billion in 2025, with projections placing it at $67.39 billion by 2030, and mental health-driven demand is cited as one of the primary forces behind that expansion. Hobby Lobby's acquisition of Joanne Fabric and craft stores. In April 2025 created the largest dedicated craft retailer in the United States, which tells you something about where the commercial infrastructure sees the growth coming from. The platform Etsy, which handles a significant volume of handmade and craft goods, recorded $2.8 billion in revenue across 2024. The market is organizing itself around something real that people are experiencing and spending money to pursue. But the market is not the most important part of this story. The most important part is the mechanism, and what the mechanism means for people who are not elite athletes, not high-performance professionals, and not in a position to spend significant amounts of money engineering optimal cognitive states for themselves. The 61.5 million Americans with a diagnosable condition. The person managing depression who picks up a pair of needles because someone mentioned it might help. The 82% who reported feeling happier. The 89.5% who felt calmer. In April 2025, a neuroscientist put an EEG headset on someone mid-craft and watched the alpha and theta waves shift on a screen, confirming with wearable technology what 8,000 crocheters already knew from their own experience. The zone does not require engineering. Sometimes it requires yarn, 2 sticks, and a pattern that sits just on the edge of what you can currently do, and the brain takes care of the rest.